Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of RPG Radio. My name is Winback, and on today's episode I'll be taking you through the early stages of Endgame with my Jagatai Khan inspired Frenzy Barbarian build. This build is definitely checking all the boxes for me in the fun department, so I do want to share all of the recent upgrades with the finishing of the Capstone dungeon, as well as giving anybody who needs them a couple tips on finishing this dungeon while underleveled and if you're solo. Especially with the barbarian and this build in particular, it requires a little bit of thought, but it ultimately wasn't that difficult. I thought it was going to be a lot worse than it was. Down below you can find the build planner for our barbarian that is updated as of this video, so you can see the aspects that we're working towards, the skills that are going into how we play this build, and what to expect for the future. Now, I do want to talk about the legendary aspects for this build first, because there are a couple of them that make things very, very easy, super fun actually, and they're fairly simple to get a hold of. So there's not many of them because this build hasn't reached ultimate late stage uniques have all been farmed kind of territory, but I think at least at this point in the Capstone dungeon you have some options, and they will help you actually finish the Capstone dungeon and really get to grips with your combo. So that being said, what I think is one of the most impressive legendary aspects for this season, specifically for this build, is the new aspect called Audacity. Audacity is going to have your character stun enemies around them for a considerable amount of time on a 20-second cooldown, but there has to be at least 5 enemies around you. Because the barbarian builds, in this case, uses the steel grasp to pull a bunch of enemies towards us, you can rip a steel grasp and basically turn it into a stun at close range. So anybody that you nab with your steel grasp is now in front of your face and stunned for 2 to 4 seconds on the low end of this aspect, but if you get the sacred one like I managed in my current playing of this build, you can get up to 6 seconds. And that is a crazy amount of time, because that gives you like 2 or 3 seconds to build up a bunch of fury with frenzy before you just start unleashing with your double swings for all that damage. This actually, I think, is probably the most impressive part of the build, at least aspect wise, because it lets you save your ground stomp for another steel grasp stun combo. So you can basically just hit the button with ground stomp if you want to get a bunch of fury and do a stun, or you can just pull the steel grasp, grab a bunch of people, and get the stun that way too without the fury. It's really really intuitive the way that it works for this build specifically, and I would highly recommend it. The only real downside to this aspect is that you have to farm it out. There isn't any dungeons that will offer this to you, and I didn't see it in any of the seasonal rewards, which is a little bit unfortunate, but it is incredibly good, and I think it's definitely going to be a mainstay of the build. It helps a lot in making your combo work, getting the most damage out of your double swing, and making sure that your fury generation stays ridiculously high up. The next big important aspect on your list is going to be the rapid aspect. This one you're going to want to put on one of your two-handed weapons so that you can get the maximum attack speed out of it. The point to that is that your two-handed weapons will give you double the effectiveness of whatever legendary aspect you are putting on them. So that means if you have a rapid aspect that is giving you the maximum, which is 30%, you put that on a two-handed weapon, and suddenly that becomes 60%. Now this rapid aspect only affects your basic skills, but because we're using Frenzy, and that's a really attack speed focused basic skill, getting 60% on that bad boy right away means that we can spool it up really fast, have it doing its maximum, efficiency, frenzy stuff, and get that much more fury generated, get people knocked down so much more often with our seasonal heart, which is the devious heart of punishing speed. Basically, you get your attacks up to a certain attack speed, and then they have a 30-ish% chance to knock down the target that you're swinging at. And when they're knocked down, if you hit them right away with a double swing, that double swing is basically free, because it will refund the resource that it takes. So as long as you have resource to spend, double swing, you'll get it back. But if you're at 0 resource and you try to hit double swing, it's not going to work, because it's not just a free double swing, which is good because spending resources in this build is still pretty important, and we'll talk about that later on. Suffice it to say, though, the basic attack speed increase is very important because frenzy is very important to this build, along with the double swing and resource generation. So remember, your big two right now are going to be your aspect of audacity and your rapid aspect. And I will mention that those two are what I think are the most important for this build to really start singing. This build does very good without a lot of legendary aspects, but when you get those two, you will notice a significant increase in what you can do with your dual wielding focused build, coupled with the talents that you have at the end of the barbarian tree with the attack speed there. There's just lots of different things going on that make this build better with just those two legendary aspects. That's not to say that we shouldn't get more, but the remaining ones that I'm going to tell you about are less important than those two. So let's talk about runner-up number 3. Let's see who gets the participation trophy. Also, don't forget that you can obtain the rapid aspect by completing the buried halls in Dry Steppes. As long as you complete that dungeon, you will be able to imprint that legendary aspect because it'll go right into your codex. But also remember that it is going to be the lowest roll possible. Anytime that you take a legendary aspect from your Codex of Power, it is going to be the minimum that it can be. In this case, with Rapid Aspect, it is going to be 15% rather than 30%. But if you're doing what I'm telling you and putting it into a two-handed legendary weapon, that is going to bump it up to 30, so you still have a pretty sizable chunk of attack speed for your basic skills. So it's definitely what you want to be looking for. That being said, though, the next aspect on the list, that runner-up we were talking about, is going to be your runic gloves of the expectant. This is another aspect that you can find from a dungeon, but you're going to have to finish the stronghold on top of it first, which is Turtelra, the burning Druid Haven castle out on the eastern side of the map in Scotland. This unlocks the Underroot dungeon, which lets you get the Gloves of the Expectant legendary aspect. But what this legendary aspect does is at any time that you attack with a basic skill, that is going to increase the damage of your next core skill by 10% up to a cap of 30. 10% is the maximum roll, 5% is the minimum roll. That being said, because we're using Frenzy, getting a lot of attacks out very quickly to charge up your next double swing is super easy. Because our attack speed is so ridiculously high, it's just not even a factor getting the expectant aspect all boosted up. Now, as far as this Capstone dungeon goes, the enemies definitely require a little bit of fancy footwork, especially the boss of the Capstone dungeon. The smaller enemies themselves are, they're not the worst thing in the world. They don't have any frost enchantments. They're mostly shock lance, which is damage, but it's avoidable damage that you can just heal through with potions. The boss, at least for the first leg of the Capstone journey, and quite honestly, the more annoying of the two is this 4-man squad of goons, we'll call them. So you do have a bit of a strategy coming into the Capstone dungeon for these 4 guys. What you want to do is get rid of the physician first, because if you get rid of the physician, that means nobody else is going to get any healing, and everybody is going to be markedly easier to kill after he's dead. After he goes down, the Grand Inquisitor is the next most annoying guy on the list, because he's always popping out ridiculous AoE blinds all over the place, and I don't know if you can tell, but being blinded is the most awful thing ever. Now when they die, they do leave a little ghost behind that will continue to mess with you, so stay very far away from the Grand Inquisitor's ghost, because it will still blind you if you're in the AoE. However, the physician, just throwing out little light balls isn't going to be a huge deal. And then after that, the Lord Commander and the Devoted Champion become incredibly easy to deal with. You just have to dodge their abilities, not take a whole bunch of damage. Lord Commander doesn't necessarily do a whole lot other than hit in big AoEs, which seem to reach a lot further than it looks like they do. But the Champion, again, he's probably even more basic than that. Just puts up a shield, does a couple pokes at you. Nothing super hard to worry about. There is a little bit of kiting required, like I mentioned, with the corpses of the other bad guys laying around, but at the same time, it's not a big deal. Right now, I do have the bubble, so when we get injured, the bubble comes up and makes us invincible. It's not bad. If you pick this up, I definitely recommend using it, because if you're melee, I mean, being invincible is never a bad thing. So yeah, just throw it on, especially if you're going into a Capstone dungeon, if you have it. Otherwise, you know, I think it's still definitely possible to play around the enemies rather than relying on any one specific legendary aspect that's not necessarily part of your build. So you can see, I mean, he's pretty simple to deal with. Trying to dodge through his body instead of around his body, because the AoEs and the big slam that he does, the hitboxes are just goofy as hell. Yeah, I mean, you can see it there. It did not look like that was going to hit me, and then suddenly it just did. So, anyway, all that aside, not an incredibly difficult boss as long as you're doing it in the right sequence, and then after that, you can move on to the much easier parts of the dungeon. The enemies in the first leg of the dungeon are more difficult than the enemies leading up to the boss in the second part of the dungeon. The dungeon boss, the boss of the dungeon after the second leg is done is going to be much more difficult than the barbershop quartet from hell. But we're a ways off of that boss, so let's take a look at some more of those legendary aspects creeping up on us. There are actually a couple uniques in this build as well that you'll probably find later on, but they do play a good part, so I'll talk about them towards the end once we can get all the legendaries out of the way. The next aspect that I wanted to talk about, though, is going to be your might, aspect of might. This one is unlockable. You can get it in the Dark Ravine in the Dry Steppes. A lot of decent barbarian aspects out in the Dry Steppes. But once you finish Dark Ravine, you get the legendary aspect that will let your basic skills give you 20% damage reduction for 2 to 6 seconds. Obviously, no matter what the duration is, because we have Frenzy, it is incredibly easy to have it up all the time, but having a 6-second duration is always much better than a 2-second duration, because if you need to like fall back and kite, like a lot of what we're doing in this video, there is much more opportunity to do that because your damage reduction lasts a long time. However, that being said, just the basis of having another 20% damage reduction is ridiculous. Defensively, all melee characters need to have as much as possible, because you're just standing in the face of every enemy in the entire game, but just remember it is really easy to activate. The duration is typically easy to work around, and it's going to make you much better at standing still and slapping the ever-loving hell out of every single bad guy that thinks that they are man enough to walk up and fight you. And then the last aspect that I really want to talk about is another one that you can't find through the method of dungeon farming, and that is going to be the weapon masters aspect. This one is going to give your weapon mastery skills an additional charge, and it's going to give them a lucky hit, which gives them a chance to stun things that they hit for 2 seconds. Now, the stun is incredibly good for our kit. It's just another method for Steel Grasp to do some CC all by its lonesome. You can also get a stun with your Rupture, but ultimately those two are weapon mastery skills, so they're both benefiting incredibly efficiently from this legendary aspect. Moreover than that, you're getting an additional charge to both of those skills, so your Steel Grasp goes up to 3 charges, Rupture goes up to 2, and if you end up wanting to take the additional charge of Steel Grasp instead of Steel Grasp giving you Berserking, you can get 4 charges of that. Not that I would recommend it, because having Berserking up more often is very important for this build, but it is possible, and you can whip out your chains all over the place, which is fun, but they don't do a whole lot of damage, so don't rely super heavily on putting points into Steel Grasp expecting it to kill enemies. It's just, at least as far as I am aware right now, it's probably not ever going to be very good at that. So, that being said, it's not ultimately super important to the build to have this aspect. It's just going to make things easier. It's going to make your abilities more well-rounded, your weapon mastery abilities, but remember that all of your damage is really coming in from Frenzy and from Double Swing. So those two abilities are the ones that you want to have rocking all the time, and your weapon mastery skills are a backup for utility's sake, in that they will be stunning and they will be healing through the process of skewering people with Rupture. Not only that, but when you, like I mentioned in the earlier video, when you hit the Steel Grasp and you get a whole bunch of people clumped up, Rupture can then deal damage because it's going to make a lot of people, explode in blood all over each other, but you shouldn't be banking on that for damage because it is even slower than the damage that we do already, and it's really cool looking, and I really love doing it, but it has gotten me killed every now and then because the enemies that get pulled in and ruptured don't necessarily get stunned enough to prevent you from dying when you pull them very, very close. So when you get to World Tier 3 and 4, things are going to be a little bit more scary with Rupture, so you do want to have a stun locked and loaded, and you don't want to be just ripping that Rupture in every scenario possible, because you will die. So I do want to mention the uniques for this build while we are getting towards the end, so that I don't forget to talk about them, because I'm pretty sure I read that our unique drop rate is going to get higher. It's maybe not for the Uber uniques, like, the Harlequin's Crest and the Doombringer, those sort of things, but for the two that you want early on in this build, they're actually very easy to find, and I didn't even hit level like 52 before I found both of the swords that I want. So the first one that we're going to talk about is the one-handed sword Ramaladni's Magnum Opus. This is going to be all the stats that we need, really, and it's got baked in increased critical strike damage because it is a sword. So Ramaladni's is going to increase damage with dual-wielded weapons, increase damage to close enemies, it's got physical damage, and it has a lucky hit with a 5% chance to restore 14% of your primary resource. That means that the effect on the unique itself is going to be lessened from its lucky hit opportunity. But what Ramaladni's does is skills using this weapon are going to deal 0.3% increased damage for each point of fury that you have, but you lose 2 fury every second. Now I know that sounds probably kind of bad, but remember at 100 fury, you've got 30% increased damage with any skills that are using this sword, and being that it's one-handed, that means both frenzy and our double swing are going to be making maximum use of it. So the way that it works out is actually really awesome, because I'll tell you, in testing this sword and playing with this sword in this build, it's possible to get your fury up so high that the drain that it has on your fury, the extra drain that it has on your fury, doesn't even matter. I've stopped swinging altogether and sat there for 2 to 3 seconds, and the fury bar has not dropped even remotely. Just absolutely fantastic stuff out of this sword, with the damage increase and all the stats that it gives us on top of everything. So this one, if you find it early on, make sure to equip it, but make sure that your fury generation is also very high up there. And the next one is going to be the Fields of Crimson. That is a big two-handed sword that makes things so much better for Rupture. You're going to get a whole bunch of points into Rupture, reducing the cooldown, not necessarily increasing the damage, which is a little bit unfortunate, but decreasing the cooldown of Rupture means that you are going to be able to use it more often, and that means that you can heal more often. So Fields of Crimson is going to have you put down a huge puddle of boiling blood for any target that you rupture while using that two-handed sword. Remember to equip it to Rupture as a skill, because you can use a dual wielding weapons to activate Rupture too. So just remember that you equip it. But once you do that, the puddle of blood underneath deals pretty decent damage, and it opens up some interesting legendary opportunities later on with bleeding as it incorporates into the barbarian kit. But again, that's a topic for another video as we get further and further into late game. But for now, just remember, Fields of Crimson reduces the cooldown of Rupture significantly. It gives you a bunch of extra bleeding damage, and it's going to add a whole lot of points to places that we desperately want them. On top of that, the stats that Fields of Crimson gives you are going to be 35% increased damage with two-handed slashing weapons, meaning the damage that we deal with Fields of Crimson. It's going to give you increased damage over time and further reduce the cooldown of Rupture, while adding 4 to 6 points into Rupture itself. So Rupture should be on a really short cooldown, meaning that we can heal very often with it, and all the damage that Rupture does is going to just be blanket increased from using the sword, period. Now, a lot of people will probably look at this sword and get kind of disappointed, but for this build, and for the bleed build that I've been holding on to for a very long time, it is incredibly good, and definitely you don't want to sleep on it, because it does wonders for the utility of our utility abilities. And that's going to be it for gear as far as legendary aspect and the uniques go. But I do want to talk about the Curator as a boss, because this was definitely more difficult as a boss than the Barbershop Quartet was, and he is significantly more difficult as a solo character, especially one that deals a lot of damage over a period of time rather than big burst damage immediately. If I were on my Deathblow Barb, this boss would not have lasted more than 30 seconds, but because we have a specific damage focused that's more consistent than bursty, things get a little bit more difficult. You can see the boss is super annoying with all the blind tornadoes that he's spitting out all the time. When it comes to the minions that the Curator summons, you want to kill the corpse bows very, very fast. And specifically, if you are playing this build, what you can do is Steel Grasp the minions that he summons, stun them, and get a whole bunch of free double swing damage onto the boss itself. It's incredibly helpful, but when you get to this point and you can stagger him, it's free double swing damage all day long. Anyway, that is it for this video. Thanks so much for hanging out if you made it this far. I know the video was a little bit light on the build guide and the Capstone dungeon guide, but hopefully you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments, and I will see you guys next time.